Today's workshop is titled Your Story Matters, Learning to Live into Our Stories of Recovery with Dr. Ben Thompson. Join Ben in this workshop that explores the science of narrative and memory. Discover how the stories we tell, both to ourselves and others, profoundly shape our recovery journeys. Gain practical strategies to foster personal growth and emotional sobriety by leveraging the power of storytelling. And Ben is a researcher at the Recovery Research Institute at Harvard Medical School. His research and clinical work focuses on the role of storytelling in bringing about personal transformations in recovery from addiction. Ben, I can't wait. I just love what you do and really appreciate that you reached out. So we're so delighted to have you here. I'll turn it over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah, again, thank you, Patrick, for having me here, and I just want to acknowledge first of all, what a what a tremendous platform this is. The Berlin Friendly Circle has been a great resource to me as a person in recovery over the last, I'd say, year or more. Um, I have been somebody who is uh, a staunch supporter of the emotional sobriety uh, conceptualization of recovery and a user of the 12 steps to that end. And so all of the resources that are made available here have just been wonderful. So I'm just very honored to be counted among them. Um, what else can I say? Oh, I think that this is just a very timely presentation to give on the heels of Cody's outstanding series on symbol and myth and the influence of Carl Jung and William James in the development of the 12 steps. So in case any of you have not heard that series, I encourage you to check that out as well. Um, okay, so yes, the title, Your Story Matters. Um, what I thought about doing was starting with a bit of a qualification and telling you some of my story, and then I thought, well, in the interest of time and in the interest of your potential lack of interest in my story here, um, I'll spare you that part and I'll use some of the details. I'll intersperse them throughout the presentation, hopefully just to give a little bit of context and make some sense of things, but. I know that time is a factor here. So what I'm going to do is start with kind of a bird's eye view, a high level perspective on just the science of story, because I want to give you a sense of what it is that I do, what I research, the clinical application of this, and then eventually I'm going to tie it um, into recovery in the 12 steps. But some of you may be surprised to learn that there's actually a whole field of scientific inquiry on narrative psychology. It's kind of a subfield of personality psychology and an attempt to understand what it is that makes us us or that makes you you. Now, I'll give you a brief disclaimer in the way of saying that actually my background, my training is in behavioral neuroscience. That's what my PhD is in. And so this represents a bit of a respecialization academically. But I say that just to say that basically any understanding of spirituality, any understanding of narrative, of story, of psychology, of what it is to be you, for me, in order for it to be uh, comprehensive, robust, it all must be grounded in evolutionary biology. That's how I make sense of things. That's the paradigm that I use. It's okay if you don't use that paradigm, but I just want to kind of, as a disclaimer, inform you that that's sort of the framework that I'll be operating within. Um, and the reason I'm I have chosen that paradigm is because if we fail to do so, um, we run the risk of introducing a sort of mind-body dualism, and it makes it much more difficult to understand how we get from the brain to the mind to the soul. And of course, this is incredibly important when we're talking about um, the threefold illness of addiction, alcoholism. We need to be able to understand comprehensively how we move from one to the other. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty. This is not going to be a biology lesson or a neuroscience lesson. I'm just going to start by observing simply what makes us unique as humans. Um, no doubt, it's easy to see the difference between a human and other animals. Yet on the one hand, we know that we have a lot in common anatomically, physiologically. We are a part of the animal kingdom. Um, and in a sense, we are just another primate. But on the other hand, we may as well be aliens on this planet. I mean, we are so different from other types of animals that it's quite hard to feel at home here in the world. I'm speaking for myself as a human and as an alcoholic. It is quite hard to feel at home in the world sometimes. And the question is why? Well, what makes us unique? What makes us different? Um, there's a lot of religious and philosophical speculation to that end, but let's just stop. Let's bracket those considerations, and we can, I think, just simply observe that it has something to do with the way that we think. We think differently than other animals. Why do we think differently, or rather, how do we think differently? Well, the thing that makes us different is our ability um, to think symbolically, to use symbols. And this is part of why I think that this talk is good on the heels of the few that came before and all the discussion lately around symbolism and addiction recovery. So what do I mean when I say symbol? To keep it simple, to keep symbols simple, uh, the words on the screen that you're looking at, each letter is a symbol. Um, to a non-English speaker or someone who is familiar with these letterings, they will have no meaning whatsoever. And then when you combine the letters together, you get a word. And again, to a non-English speaker, that that word, that series of letters has no meaning, nor does the sentence that you see on the screen. So the point of a symbol is its meaning. It represents something that it is not. It's really important to understand that because everything else kind of hinges on that. We have the ability to think in symbolic terms, representationally. Um, Not only do we have this tendency or the ability, it's so hardwired into us that we can hardly resist the impulse. We are constantly looking for deeper meanings, deeper association for things. And this is sort of a matter of what it is to be a human. Um, so why? Why do we have this ability and this compulsion to seek the symbolic connection between things? It has to do with language. Language is a way of communicating. Obviously, it's what we're doing now. But to use symbols makes it highly efficient and highly effective. There is a way of you may know that in other languages there are words that we don't have words for in ours. And so we can be a bit hamstrung in our ability to communicate without a particular word to refer to a particular phenomenon. Um, Nevertheless, the words that we do have, we try to piece together, and they make it more efficient than, let's say, sign language, or trying to mime your way in a different culture where you don't speak the language and you're limited to, kind of gestures. This is what symbols allow us to do, and the reason why language is so critical is because we have evolved to depend upon each other. Um, the niche that we have evolved for is community. And I want to read a quote to you real quick that I think helps drive this point home uh, a little bit better. It says, to understand the role in human evolution of culture, it is helpful to start with the beaver. Beavers exhibit the remarkable trait of damming up streams to form ponds and then inhabiting the ponds, thereby protecting themselves from predators. This trait is clearly hardwired. If the sound of running water is broadcast to captive beaver, listen to this. This is so cool. If the sound of running water is broadcast to beavers in captivity, they nevertheless proceed to pile sticks on top of the speakers. It also exemplifies niche construction. Beavers are adapted to the ponds that they themselves create. They are selected for the ability to produce the niches on which they depend. And so it is with humans. The niche to which we are adapted is human culture. That is a niche which we ourselves construct. We are selected for our ability to produce and inhabit culture-based niches. Human culture is encoded in and acquired by means of symbolic languages. This means that we have been selected for our symbolic minds in the same way the beavers have been selected for their dam building skills. So we need symbols. We don't just need symbols, we rely on symbols in order to inhabit the cultures, the human systems that support our continued survival and existence. Now, all organisms have memory, have a type of memory. This is whether it's stored in the genes or whether it's stored in the brains and the nervous systems. Part of what makes living systems unique compared to non-living systems is that it's processing information and it's storing information in memory. And the point of storing information in memory is to make predictions about the future so that you can sustain your existence, you can survive. Um, Humans do that too, but what's different about our experience with memories is that this symbolic tendency that we have, our symbolic faculty, actually commandeers, it co-ops our memories. So we don't just remember things that happen. We don't just remember events randomly. We find meaning in them and we create stories. So that's really the basis of stories, of narrative. It's fair to say that um, no other organism has the ready access to symbols that we have. No other organism has the ready access to story that we have, because our symbols make use of, they leverage our memories. Now, this is helpful for a few reasons, and this is part of what has made us as a species so incredibly successful over the millennia. Um, Part of the reason that this is helpful is that it gives us context to interpret the meaning of certain events. It also helps us to organize. So a narrative, one of the hallmark features of a narrative is that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? There's a flow of events over time. That's what a story does. It helps keep things kind of cohesive and coherent. And in that way, it helps to serve as a mnemonic. It helps you to remember cause and effect over time. Stories do this in a way that other random memories cannot. And I can tell you that people who have suffered damage to the parts of their brain that keep track of long-term memory are very disoriented. That's one of the sadder parts. And I'm not necessarily referring to Alzheimer's. I'm referring to um, damage in other parts of the brain. But that's one of the more demoralizing aspects of it is that they can no longer organize the information as it's coming into them over time. And therefore, they kind of lose a sense of themselves. Now, this is certainly true in Alzheimer's, where you can see the relevance of memory to identity. But what stories ultimately do is they help us keep track of these personal experiences, thereby providing us with a sense of unity, because life is random. Life can seem quite random. I'm not saying that it is. This is not a metaphysical claim. I'm just saying, from our perspective, oftentimes there is the question, why me? Why did this happen to me? How did A lead to B? Well, unless you are the common denominator, they are in fact random events. But if you are the common denominator, if they are part of your story, then that helps to unify these events. And if it helps to unify these events and you're encoding memories over time, then it gives you a sense of direction. At least you can begin to anticipate what might come next, for better or for worse. Um, it's a predictive strategy. It's future facing. And if it's future facing, then that means it has to do with purpose. We've already said that symbols have to do with meaning. And now I'm saying that stories have to do with purpose and meaning. They're about the future. They represent something. And so ultimately, these provide the basis for how we come to understand ourselves. Um, these evolved tendencies, which have to do with the way that our brains are uniquely organized, um, ultimately form the basis for how we come to know ourselves through story. And that's critical. I'm not saying there aren't a lot of other ways to know yourselves. Identity has become a hot button topic in our popular culture and in media. I am not talking about that necessarily. I'm talking about a specific type of identity, which is called narrative identity. Narrative identity, you can think of it as emerging. It emerges from the way that we piece together our recollected past, our perceived present, and our imagined future. So there's a through line running through each of these um, that we are always having to try to assemble to make sense of, and and we're not talking about the historical events. Again, I want to remind you, this isn't an explanation. We're not concerned with facts. We're concerned with meanings. That's what a story does. It captures the meaning that the person has made, how they have made sense out of their experience. And I would say that that is ultimately um, what you are. What you are is the sense that you have made out of your experiences. Or I should say who you are. Who you are. Your identity is a sense that you have made out of the experiences, past, present, and in the anticipated future. Let's see. Now, a couple of things to consider about narrative identity. Like I say, it depends less on what actually happened. I'm not saying those things aren't important. I'm not saying that the actual events are irrelevant. I'm saying that your identity depends less on what actually happened and more on how you make sense out of what happened. And so, as I said before, narrative gives us context to make sense out of things in a way that we wouldn't otherwise have. So there's a cognitive benefit to narrative. To give you an example, and this isn't exactly a narrative example, but it's a symbolic example. Notice here, in this sequence of letters and in this sequence of numbers, the B and the 13 are exactly the same. They're the exact same characters, but I'm willing to bet that your brain had no difficulty understanding the difference in the meaning of these characters, these symbols. And the reason is because of the context. Story gives us context. It helps us see things differently. So how you make sense of what happened or what is happening depends on, again, how you see things. I'm using this sort of metaphorical language because I'm not talking about your actual vision. I'm talking about what's going on in your mind's eye. In other words, how you frame your attention, the things that you're paying attention to. Okay. Now, another question as to where do we get our narrative identity? I've already talked about the relevance of culture. Um, we create culture and we depend on culture. And what does culture consist of? Culture consists of symbols. Ultimately, it's like the um, the entirety of all the systems of belief and symbols and points of reference. Um, Culture also embodies, in a way, a certain type of story. It is the framing. They provide the framing for how we are to make sense of things. So to make reference again to the language example that I keep coming back to, if you are not a speaker of English, um, then an English dictionary is going to be of very little use to you. But if you're a speaker of English, then an English dictionary is going to really provide you basically as much information as you need to understand the meaning of how words fit together and their definitions, etc. It is a frame. A dictionary is a frame in that sense. There is also a, you can call it a phenomenon, master narratives. Uh, our cultures provide a frame for how we are to interpret our stories. And again, this is, I think, a good it piggybacks off of the previous series on the role of myth and archetype in the development of the 12 steps and its relevance to spirituality. There is actually a lot of discourse and debate as to whether or not these myths come hardwired into us as well. It could be. Um, I'm bracketing that from consideration for now, and let's just uh, suffice it to say that we also receive these things through our programming, so to speak, our social programming. Um, a good example and a good read, if ever you're interested, this book, The Redemptive Self. Now, this person, Dan McAdams, who wrote the book, is kind of the godfather of narrative psychology and this idea of narrative identity. And spoiler alert, I'll tell you that the basic thesis of this book is that Americans have kind of uniquely learned to live by, and that's how he defines a master narrative is stories we live by. Americans, at least initially, figured out a way to live by a redemptive story. And I'm going to say a little bit more about what I mean by redemptive in a minute. But here we're talking about the so-called self-made man, the rags to riches story, overcoming all obstacles, the American dream, this sort of thing. Uh, no doubt that uh, that that theme, that master narrative has expanded globally, right? So across the world now, people are not only aware that that is a potential way to think about themselves in the world, but they are also aspiring to fit themselves to that narrative. That's not always a good thing. That actually has some really negative impacts in certain cultures and in certain contexts. But that's not what we're talking about. All I'm doing is drawing your attention to the fact that such a thing exists, and this has a lot to do with where we're getting our the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. Okay, so far I've given you an evolutionary and I would say psychological and sociocultural perspective on how we get to this experience of who we are. I promise you I'm not going to bore with you with these kinds of details too much longer, but it's really helpful background. Okay. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we study, how we examine the personal stories that people tell. And this is both in the laboratory and also I make good use of this clinically. It is increasingly being used clinically. But as I have now stated multiple times, we're not interested necessarily in the facts, in what actually happened. It's important. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but what is more important from my perspective are the themes. And there are a few themes that we like to bear in mind that help us kind of know what to look for. So if a person is telling me their story, let's say clinically, um, and by the way, we we take for granted just how steeped in story we actually are. We absolutely neglect to acknowledge the extent to which our consciousness is just it is story. That's basically what it is. I'm not talking about the Eastern kind of pure consciousness. I'm just talking about, the way that we do our life. So much of it is just storied. If somebody's telling me about their day, they're telling me a story. If somebody is telling me about um, some a-hole who cut them off on the highway, they're telling me a story. Um, if I am uh, if I am stuck in a pattern of negative self-talk, it's usually by way of story. So what am I listening for? Well, I'm listening for the motivational themes. I'm asking myself, because oftentimes we're not intentional about the stories that we tell. We're just communicating the things that we see in our head out loud with words. Um, so I'm listening and I'm saying, what did this person want? So let's use an example of a resentment, because I think that's appropriate given the audience, given kind of the context here. If somebody is talking to me about a resentment that they have, then the question that I ask myself is what did this person want that they feel they didn't get? That would give me an answer to their motivation. Did they want power and control? Did they want agency? Did they want to feel connected with somebody? Um, these are examples of motivations. The second thing I'm listening for is how the story starts and how the story ends. And by that I mean, like, what's the tone? What's the emotional theme? If it starts on a high note and ends on a bad note, the way that somebody's story might if they were in active addiction, that would be what's called a contamination theme. It's really where chaos has overtaken order, and it's just not possible to keep up with the unmanageability. They cannot, in other words, they cannot make sense of their own suffering. Yet if the story starts bad and ends good, that's what's called a redemptive theme. And that's what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about the redemptive self here. This is the type of framing that is very common to, let's say, the American influence. A starting off bad and ending up good. And I'm not saying that that is necessarily good or bad, but I'll talk a little bit about what the implications of that way of framing the story are um, for our well-being. The other thing I'm looking for is meaning making. Um, so I'm basically looking at the lens that they're using. I think of myself in a clinical context as sort of like an optometrist. I'm not um, interested necessarily in what they're seeing. I'm more interested in what they're seeing through. I'm interested in their lens and I'm interested in their frame, which is going to have everything to do with what they're experiencing. Um, and I'm also interested in how they connect the events of a given story to themselves. So if a oh, I'm literally picking this example out of thin air, although this has happened on more than one occasion where I will be working with a client who is thinking about leaving their spouse, and they'll be thinking about leaving their spouse for um, I don't know, varying lengths of time. And then one day, I I will meet with them and they'll say, you know what? I think I've decided to stay with my spouse. And I'll say, oh, well, to what do you attribute that? In other words, what was the turning point? This is where I find meaning making at the turning point. People make sense of change in their life through turning point events. And perhaps you can think of a point of reference in your own life where you were headed down one path and then something happened and you received either some insight came to you, you realized something, and it changed the trajectory of what followed. So I'm listening for that. And then finally, I'm listening for structural elements. So I'm listening, is their story coherent? Um, are they able to put together the pieces of the story in a chronological way? Remember, I said that's one of the benefits of narrative is it helps us organize things, beginning, middle, end. Sometimes if a person's story is all over the place, that's going to indicate to me a few things. Perhaps they do not have a clear sense of self. That can happen for a number of reasons, including early childhood trauma, adverse childhood events, um, or even later in life trauma. It can have to do with what they're going through in the moment. So they could be in the middle of a very low point in life where nothing makes sense and everything feels incoherent. They could be uh, suffering the consequences of chronic neurotoxic insult to the brain through continued drinking or continued drug use. That can disrupt parts of the brain that have to do with processing long-term memories. It can make it very difficult to access these types of autobiographical events. And then I'm asking myself, is it clear? Does it make sense to me? Okay. Now, what's the point of all of this? Like it's well and good and I think a worthy enterprise in and of itself just to take some time to learn yourself. But that can be a little narcissistic. It can be a little self-involved and a little self-indulgent unless there's some sort of um, greater motivation, unless it serves some purpose beyond itself. I'd say the first benefit is that people who have certain types of themes, motivational themes, and emotional tones, people who make meaning differently and tell a coherent story um, have better or worse health outcomes. So if somebody's telling me a story about uh, trying to get sober, and they uh, are describing themselves as helpless victims, or just being tossed about by the cravings, they don't have much agency. Um, People who have more agency in their stories as a motivation tend to have better outcomes. If somebody is only telling me a contamination story and there's no redemptive arc, they're more likely to relapse. When people do not make meaning and there's no turning point event, or if the turning point event doesn't have a whole lot to do with themselves, it was more like, I got uh, incarcerated. I was arrested, but they don't really see how they were involved in the process. Doesn't make any personal meaning to them. They're less likely to remain abstinent. So the point of all of this and the stories that I'm examining, both uh, experimentally and clinically, is to make better predictions about recovery outcomes, and also to be able to potentially improve those recovery outcomes. Because if you change your story, you can change your outcomes. And that's really the point. Okay, so I've bored you enough with the science. Again, please forgive me. I think it was necessary just in the way of providing some background. Now, what I'm going to do is tell you more about explicitly how storytelling relates to recovery. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience. I'm not going to get into a whole drunk-a-log and war stories and that kind of thing. I'm going to keep it very brief, um, except to say a couple of things. Um, the Let's see. The first time I tried to get into recovery, I was 17. Um, I didn't know that I was getting into recovery. That wasn't the point. The point was to eliminate the consequences, the ever mounting consequences in my life. I did what I saw other people do who used to drink and drug like me, which was to get involved in the church. I am from a part of the States where religiosity is kind of paramount, and so that was basically the resource that I had at my disposal. I got involved in the church. I was 17, so I grew spiritually, I would say, and I did not drink for the next 3 years, but I did not really understand the connection between alcohol and myself, you see. And this is part of the point in what I was saying about meaning making and how to draw those self-event connections. I just knew that alcohol at the time equaled consequences. What I did not know was that abstinence at the time didn't equal immunity from future consequences. I thought, well, I've got this pretty well under control. And so I drank again after about 3 years. And for the next almost decade, just burned my life to the ground, basically. I have no problem telling you people that. It was terrible and tragic, and that's just my side of the story. Um, but it was not as though I wasn't trying to get better. I was trying desperately to get better. I had tried everything I could think of, and I should mention that I was doing my dead level best to think my way out of the problem, as though more facts were going to help me solve the problem, as opposed to more meaning. Um, I was hell-bent on self-reliance. I figured if I got myself into this mess, I can get myself out of this mess. And I was using a lot of cognitive behavioral strategies. I was making these just insane list of costs and benefits and trying to keep track of all the consequences. And I was learning about craving, and I was doing outpatient stuff, and I was doing continued therapy. And, it was just getting worse and worse and worse. Didn't matter what I threw at it. Um, I had pretty well given up on God and religion through these experiences, because the more I prayed, the more I just felt forsaken. Nothing was getting better, and I felt like a spiritual solution was probably just pie in the sky at that point for me. Started attending Alcoholics Anonymous somewhat, I would say, regularly in 2009. And yeah, at the beginning of 2009, and I did not get sober until the very end of 2010. So for 2 years regularly, I was attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. And it was, of course, research and experimentation. I wasn't one of those people. Um, I would identify as an addict. I thought that pretty well captured the cluster of behaviors that I was struggling with more. Um, and and but nevertheless, I kept coming around, and I have a couple of distinct memories here that are important. The first was, I don't know, after about 6 months, um, I remember a guy at a noontime meeting picking up a 9-year medallion. And by the way, the meeting was full, which I thought was mind-blowing that there were this many people at a noontime meeting, who all seemed to be regulars and somewhat successful, and happy. And I remember it got around to me, and and I said, my name is Ben, and I don't know what I am, but I want what you have. And I didn't mean that I wanted a 9-year medallion. I mean, I wanted to laugh the way that they were laughing. I wanted to laugh from the belly. I had not been free since I don't know when. I had only had like this really sick, nervous laugh in my throat. Um, if ever I laughed. I wanted to have a sense of meaning and purpose. My presence and absence made absolutely no difference to anybody so far as I could tell. But these people expected to see each other there on a daily basis. I wanted these things and I didn't know how to get them. Fast forward a few months, and several pretty extreme negative events later, uh, I it was it was December 28, 2010. I was living in Boston, and I uh, I remember that was the first of a series of blizzards that we would be hit with. I think we got like 86 inches of snow that year, and I was unaccustomed to that, but I had nowhere to go. There was nowhere else I could go. Um, I had no family I could be with. I had no friends that wanted to be with me. And so I trudged a couple of miles through the snow to this meeting where there were only about two or three people. And um, I remember sitting there as I had in every other meeting with my arms folded, completely closed off to the entire experience and to the group of people. Um, a guy was picking up his 3-year medallion. I can't remember what was said, except that I heard somebody say, we have to identify, not compare. That that was it. That was my turning point because I realized all of a sudden, this is why I can't get what they have. I have been looking for every possible reason why I'm different. I have been looking for everything in my story, how it doesn't line up, how I am better than, how I'm worse than, how I'm older than, how I'm younger than, um, how my drinking and drug use was look differently, etc. I've got this, mental illness or that physical ailment, whatever. I was looking for reasons why I was different. I tell you that story to say that there was no new information. Nothing happened. It was just another meeting. But my frame changed. My frame changed. What I saw was different. It was the way I describe it, um, it was like Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, the spiritual experience that he has when he's visited by the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future. And I had said that I was an alcoholic before, but it meant something different. See, it was a symbol, and it had a different meaning, and it meant maybe that I couldn't really control my drinking, but now it took on a new meaning. When I identified for the first time, it took on a new meaning, and the meaning was it's not just that you can't control and you one day might, it's that you can never control, and if you continue to try, you will die. And so it was like I was seeing the ghost of Christmas future in that fateful scene where he's pointing to the grave, and Scrooge says, "Spirit, spirit, tell me, is this the way that it will be or the way that it might be?" And he just points to the grave. And that was the emotion that I was gripped with. Now my motive has changed. You see, the meaning changed, the motive changed. The motive used to, I don't know what I thought. I was going to recreational AA. I don't know, but in any case, now it was desperate, and I held on to it, with the desperation of a dying man, and I became incredibly open-minded because I was at, what they call a low point. The only difference between a low point, what they call hitting bottom, a low point, um, and a turning point is the meaning that you make out of it. I was at a desperate, desperate low point in my story. Contamination run rampant, chaos run amok, unmanageability that was unspeakable. And I had a realization. My frame changed, my motive changed, my actions changed, you see. And why did I have that change in frame? Because I had gone to AA for the past 2 years regularly. And I inadvertently and unknowingly steeped myself into this master narrative. They taught me how to tell my story. Of course, I told my story all the time. I loved it. That was the whole reason that I drank and drugged the way that I did half the time was for the story. I had no problem telling stories. I didn't know how to tell my story. And I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was. And I had to hear them tell their stories for over 2 years before it started to make sense to me, before the words even started to penetrate my mind and my soul, so that meaning could be made differently. So this is the value of story listening in recovery. And it's not by chance. I'm not this is not speculation. This was by design. In the big book, it says, we believe that it is only by fully disclosing ourselves and our problems that those non-identifiers, will be persuaded to say, yes, I am one of them too. I must have this thing. On the very next page, starting a new chapter, it says, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. The delusion that we are like other people, or presently maybe, has to be smashed. Here's my little figure of what it is, um, to identify. You've got the narrator sharing of their experience, and then over time, me and the audience listening, I'm sharing in their experience. It's not like our experiences were identical. They were all unique experiences, but they were enough alike. There was enough similarity. And if I forced myself to identify, I could see even more similarities in the way that we felt, and the way that we thought. So this is part of the value of storytelling, and this is part of how it begins to change us, is through the story listening, and it provides a framing, a new frame. So, as I said, I had learned everything that I could about craving. And by the way, as a neuroscientist, we have no shortage of theories about craving. That is a phenomenon that is very well understood. We understand it by way of dopamine. We understand it by way of cortisol and stress. We understand it. We understand craving like you wouldn't believe. But that's such a small part of the problem, because craving only refers to when you've got it in your system, when you're so quote unquote under the influence. But the real problem, it says, centers in the mind, in the absence of the substance, after periods and intervals of recovery, relief, uh, reprieve. There's no defense against the first drink. It says the fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We are unable at certain times to bring into consciousness with sufficient force. It's another word for memory. Another word for power. The memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defense against the first drink. There was always a curious mental phenomenon that parallel with our sound reasoning, there inevitably ran some insanely trivial excuse for taking the first drink. Our sound reasoning failed to hold us in check. The insane idea won out. The alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against his first drink. His defense must come from a higher power. So what I would say, the language that is used in the book is these are called the strange mental blank spots. I call it amnesia. It is a type of amnesia. It is not a forgetting merely of the consequence. It's really a forgetting of who you are. If the first step of recovery is admitting to our innermost self that we're different somehow categorically, then the first step of relapse is forgetting that you're different, forgetting who you are, what you are. And that's a type of amnesia. So what's the solution? It says his defense must come from a higher power. Well, how do you get the higher power? Again, now there have been several recent workshops presented through this group that talk about this at a level that I think is really expert. And if you have a chance to go back and listen to them, please do. Um, but my understanding is that the way to get access to the higher power is through a spiritual experience. In fact, the only definition of alcoholism that the Big Book presents is an illness that only a spiritual experience can conquer. And it defines a spiritual experience in two places, and there is a solution. And in the appendix on the spiritual experience, it says that a spiritual experience is the process whereby the ideas, attitudes, and emotions that were once the guiding force of individuals' lives are suddenly cast aside in favor of a new set of conceptions and motives. In other words, the story changed. Who you are, the direction, the unity, the sense that you have made out of your experience changes because of a turning point in favor of a new set of conceptions and motives. There's a new direction. That's a spiritual experience. In the appendix, it describes it as a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. So what has to change in a spiritual experience? I used to make a big deal out of this. Like I really thought that this was something that I could not abide as someone who had given up on spirituality altogether. Now I see it's a matter of our stories changing, and not in an inauthentic way. We don't tell a lie. We just learn how to look at our experiences differently, which is why Chuck C said that that a spiritual experience is nothing more than a new pair of glasses. You're looking at things differently, habitually differently. Coming back to how do you get that how do you get the access to the power? Well, the quote taken from page 45 in We Agnostic. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main objective is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself. Let's say greater than your own story right now. Um, a, you're trying to access a power that comes from a story that is different than the one you've been telling yourself, which will solve your problem. Not for nothing, a lot of people don't realize this when they refer to the big book. The actual title is Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. So we're talking about a master narrative here. Again, this is its own culture that teaches individuals how to frame their experiences and how to tell a story about what they've gone through. This is important, I think. Um, this is a quote from my academic and alcoholic hero, Ernest Kurtz, who says, AA literature delineates a spirituality conveyed by the telling of stories of experience, strength, and hope. Stories that disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. It is on this basis that the 12 steps are presented, as the very next sentence of how it works invites. If you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. Remember the experience I said? My name is Ben. I don't know what I am, but I want what you have. Groups that center their practice on sharing what things are like and how they feel about that do not offer the same program. They may provide great therapeutic benefits and even valid spiritual consolation, but the change from we to things and the shift from deciding and willing to feeling, these are not unsubstantial variations. Perhaps you've had this experience of being at a meeting and feeling worse when you left than when you came in. I would ask yourself, what types of stories are being told there? Are they stories about what we were like, what happened, and what we're like now? Or are they stories about, uh, what happened to me and how I feel about it? It's the difference between a redemption story and a contamination story, essentially. And I would ask yourself even further, what kinds of stories do I tell? How do I frame my own experience? You've no doubt heard the differentiation between carrying the mess and carrying the message. I would say that the message is inherently redemptive. And it's not merely redemptive. It's not merely about ending on a high note or a high point. It's more about describing the process of personal growth, describing the process of personal transformation, where we're not talking about achieving perfection. Rather, we're just talking about a process of ongoing progress. So here is the template for the so-called recovery master narrative. Just to remind you, it goes something like what we used to be like, what happened, what we're like now. Um, where you can see in this schematic, maybe things got a little bit better in early childhood or at whatever point after which where addiction sets in. It says first or early drinking, and that precipitates a downward trajectory, hitting bottom. Like I said, the only difference between a low point and a turning point is the meaning that's made. What's the sense that is made out of this experience here? This is where I take issue where people will talk about, like, you don't have to hit bottom, you don't have to hit bottom. Well, it just depends on how you define bottom, how you define hitting bottom. I'm not talking about the lowest point you've ever reached. In the literature, it describes it as simply the point at which you stop digging. You hit bottom when you stop digging. In other words, when you make meaning differently out of your experience, and that leads to a decision, which leads to an action, just the smallest incremental action in the opposite direction. Progress in the program, stable recovery. So this depicts the process of ongoing progress, which is important to remember. That it's not like you just merely return back to baseline. Hopefully you will exceed whatever baseline was and then continue over a period. Although, this is a way oversimplification of what the actual process is like. No doubt it won't be linear at all. There will be peaks and troughs and setbacks, and um, that is, of course, part of the not just the process of recovery, but just of the process of personal growth and development. And this is another figure that kind of describes what I was referring to when I said that I look for coherence in stories. So when I first started coming around into AA, and I would tell my story, I found a sponsor, and some of his first advice to me was, "Okay, now go tell your story." And I was like, "No, no, you don't understand. I don't do that. I'm shy. I don't really like public speaking." And he says, "Yeah, do it anyway." Oh, okay. So I tell my story, and I'm quite sure it made no sense whatsoever. It was probably just incoherent. Um, I had no practice telling my story. Also, I was detoxing. Um, so there was a lot working against me, and I felt as though it was a fairly traumatic experience. And I stepped down from that, and I said, "I'll never do that again." And the next opportunity rolled around. He says, "All right, go tell your story." And I'm like, "Oh God, no, not again." I told it again, and I told it again, and I told it again, and I told it again. And you know what? I had the experience of not just rehearsing my story over time. Things started to get clearer. I was going back in my mind, and I was actually seeing, oh no, this caused that. This is how I felt there. So I was getting back in touch with experiences, and then I was learning how to find the upward trajectory. I was learning how to redeem my own story. And what this describes is kind of like an incoherence in the beginning, telling of the story, and then it becomes a little bit clearer through the spelling out of the word narrator or narration, as things make more sense over time. You're kind of capitalizing on that experience of hindsight being 2020, um, where life must be lived uh, forward, but can only be understood in reverse. Um, the other thing that I want to say about this part of it is remember that the problem that was observed initially as the alcoholic amnesia, we'll call it, just the amnesia that's common to all addictive disorders, forgetting of the consequences, and forgetting who you are. Um, I describe it to people like this. Have you ever been in a grocery store or in a car, and you hear a song that you have not heard in 20 years? And you may have a couple of experiences all at once. You may think to yourself, "Oh God, it's been forever since I've heard that song." And then you might think, um, "I remember where I was the last time I heard that song. Maybe it was a sad event, or maybe it was happy, but it brings you back to an emotional place within you." And then, and this is the most bizarre part of it all, you remember the lyrics. You've not heard the song in 20 years, and somehow in your brain has been the lyrics that only required the prompting by the melody. And it's that way with telling our stories. When we tell our stories, and when we learn to tell our stories, that's the melody. We hear the stories, we tell our stories, and it brings us back to a place internally where we're able to tap into something and we're able to recall with sufficient force. the pain, the suffering, the humiliation months, years ago. But not only that, we don't do it in isolation. I'm not telling myself my story. We do it in community. I tell it to somebody else. And so there's an opportunity for those negative experiences to be redeemed. They get a chance to hear it. They get a chance to identify potentially. They get a chance to begin to make sense out of their experiences and not feel so all alone. Now, I want to say something about so far I've described storytelling in the sense of the fellowship, but I'd really be remiss to not point out the fact that the the actual instructions that are presented to us as a way of getting that spiritual experience that is supposed to be the solution to the problem of alcoholism are the 12 steps. And if you look really closely, each of the 12 steps has to do with your story. In fact, there's no way of doing the 12 steps without reflecting on your story. As I said, the step one, admitting that you're different from others. Your life, your story has become unmanageable. Um, Step three, I should point out, what you're turning over, your will and your life, is nothing more than um, the imagined future, the idea that you have for how the story ought to end. Um, this preoccupation with what's going to happen. And I could go on and on. Obviously, the fourth step, if you've done it and if you follow the instructions out of the text, um, provide to my mind one of the most comprehensive dismantling of the old story and allow you to start to make new meaning out of your story so that by the end of these steps, if you've gone through them, you have completely taken apart that old self, that old narrative identity. I would consider the 12 steps an ecology of practices that are designed to dismantle the ego, which is, disguised as the old narrative identity. What's the result? The result is a spiritual awakening. The result is a spiritual awakening, and the motivation to carry the message. Now you've got a message and not a mess to carry. Um, and through all this, I could make reference to Alan Berger's great series on emotional sobriety and the relevance of the space between the stimulus and the response. But as you dismantle your story and take it apart and really begin to look at um, what was really going on, you'll find that space. As you take the time to write it out, you'll find that space. You'll find the freedom that I was looking for, the ability to laugh from the belly and not the throat. Um, this is a pathway not just to a new self, not just to a spiritual experience, but also to the emotional sobriety that we're really after. We're looking for balance. We're looking for peace of mind. Um, and this is how you find it, but you have to actually know yourself. And how do you know yourself? You have to know your story, and you have to be able to tell your story. Um, and I think that's all from me. I'm going to open it up to questions.
And thank you so much.